stolen it from you.
Okay, so let me warn you that there are not many squids in this talk. I know there will be a great deal of disappointment. And the way this presentation will proceed is I will talk about the general idea behind a program we're trying to establish here at the labs, and we'll also present the gist of what we're trying to do with neutral atom quantum simulators, after which I'll ask Hartmut to get up here and take my place and talk about the trapped ion part of our collaboration, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions that come up. So this is a collaboration that we are establishing here at the lab, and we hope to have it as a long-running activity, both at the lab and with connections down onto campus. And the folks that are part of this collaboration, you've seen peppering the daises over the last 3 days of the meeting. We've been doing things like introducing people. And you also see a lot of overlap between who is active within this new collaboration and who is actively participating in the Center for Quantum Coherent Science down on campus. And that's indeed that's exactly the kind of synergy we're trying to establish, which will enable new things to happen both down the hill and up here. The topic of today is quantum simulation. So just since I see our Google representative in the back, we should wonder what is the role of quantum simulation and how does it relate to quantum computation? How does it relate also to other scientific pursuits? So here's a timeline, perhaps, and so we know where we stand at present. There's a variety of hardware choices that people have been working on over the years that have various aspects of what we hope to see in quantum computers. They have various levels of quantum coherence, different aspects, different prospects for scalability, demonstration often of 1 and 2 qubit gate operations with increasingly good fidelity. I don't think the question of how exactly to scale up, how to make systems that are, for example, in the squid systems in particular, or the solid-state spins, how to make them homogeneous enough that many of them can be wired together and be expected to interact. And we also are not really quite clear how we're going to achieve sufficient speed to rival things that are done in numerical computation. But nevertheless, we hope that from today's starting points, we will, in the very far future, or perhaps even just 10 years from now, we will have the whole enchilada. And we will indeed have quantum Turing machines whizzing away up here at the lab, solving the outstanding problems of scientific computation, and out there in the world tracking down who's in your Google Photos portfolio so you can sell them things. And the question is, what do we do in the meanwhile that has utility? And I think quantum simulation can be regarded perhaps as this intermediate step, which is a way to use the things we have now or the things we have in the near future and increasingly try to find ways to apply them to real outstanding problems. And here at the lab, we understand that there's, in particular, there's challenges to computation. There's applications where we're spending a lot of our computing time, and if there's a way to make improvements on just a few of those through quantum simulation, short of the whole enchilada, then maybe we'll have done something useful. And so the idea is that much of scientific computing, as we've just heard about from Jared's talk, is spent trying to calculate how nature, the properties of nature, often to simulate materials and or chemicals and their dynamics. And so one can certainly use a general quantum Turing machine to answer questions about materials and in chemistry and photosynthesis and whatnot. But one can also hope to achieve a similar exploration by a direct quantum simulation. So you think about either in a digital manner or in an analog as in a representational manner, try to recreate experimentally a copy of a model of a physical system, and then probe the properties of that model by letting it run forward, propagate forward in time, find its own ground state, and then you go ahead and might analyze the results of that kind of experiment as a way of understanding what the model has indeed predicted, and therefore knowing whether it's a good description of materials or chemicals that you've wanted to understand. And you know, while this might seem like a limited use of quantum coherent technology, of the highly entangled many-body stuff we're going to be making in our labs, in fact, you recognize that just addressing such a problem, just having an experimental representation of things that occur in several natural systems would already be an enormous contribution to computer science and computer research. It would directly address the things that we spend a lot of our time trying to understand with such devices. Not everything, but a lot. And you saw this from Jared, although his was with a white background, this is a black background. And I just want to emphasize that we're interested not just in the Hamiltonian evolution of systems, but we're also interested in Lagrangians, which are maybe more suitable for the description of continuous fields. And we're also interested in Liouvilleans, which is the evolution of systems that are in an open environment. And all of these are accessible to quantum simulation, and all of them have some very high scientific importance. So we hope that quantum simulators can help us tackle, you know, subsets of these types of problems. Now, which, you know, I discussed that there is a variety of hardware choices for quantum computation, and in the end, perhaps one of them will be the cheapest one to scale up and build that quantum Turing machine. But until we get to that point, we wonder which of those technologies we should make sure to have in our quantum simulation portfolio in order to apply quantum simulations as broadly as we can. And I would say that which tool you use for the job has to do with which problem you're trying to solve. And so maybe there's a question of mimicry here, that if you are trying to understand the behavior of a particular system, it might behoove you, it might be the fastest route to getting answers, to use a physical system that has a close resemblance to what it is you're trying to describe. So within our collaboration in particular, what we have here at the lab and also down on campus are these three types of simulation or eventually quantum computation technologies, and each of them has its own distinct strengths. So we've heard a lot in the last few days about how rapidly the technology of superconducting quantum circuits is developing, and they clearly have the advantage that they can be operated very quickly, that there's flexibility in wiring them together capacitively or however you wish. And one of the things that I find particularly intriguing is that you can make really rapid measurements on such systems, perhaps even as they're still undergoing evolution, and thereby study a host of questions in open quantum systems of a few-body nature. We also have, through Hartmut-Hefner's lab, we have access to trapped ions. And trapped ions, as we've been hearing also from Peter's talk, have a precise construction in the sense that all the ions are indeed the same, and the gate fidelities are becoming insanely high. And also they have the aspect that not only do the ions possess a spin or internal degree of freedom, but there's also the motional state of the ion, which, as Hartmut will explain, gives access to particular problems. And then finally, neutral atom quantum simulators have the advantage that they're quite large, and one can immediately start working with systems of hundreds or even millions of quantum objects. And they're ones that naturally realize translationally invariant or simulations of large-scale systems where there are near-neighbor interactions. So as such, they seem very well suited for answering questions about materials. Okay, so let me just talk briefly about what we have in mind here. Neutral atom quantum simulators are already a very capable device. So in laboratories, to some degree in my lab, but also in other advanced labs in the world, one can take a gas of cold atoms, trap them in a lattice that's formed by the intersection of several laser beams, and making use of the weak interaction between these atoms, one can coax the atoms to fill an array almost with unity filling and with very few defects. And this array is then your, let's say, 2 or perhaps 1 or perhaps 3-dimensional array of quantum objects in which you hope to instigate some interesting many-body quantum physics. People have developed microscope techniques that allow you to address and also measure the state of each and every one of these objects. So it really seems like the dream platform to some degree for quantum simulation. In fact, I will argue that a neutral atom quantum, these kinds of quantum gas microscopes are very far on the way toward quantum computation. One indeed has, there have been experiments very early on that demonstrated that one can create, let's say, cluster states where each atom is entangled with its neighbors. There are ways to manipulate single atoms with very high fidelity. And the readout also has very high fidelity. So if I think about what's required to go from that amount of resource to quantum computation is essentially localized non-destructive measurement, which would enable you to also apply a quantum error correction to such a problem, to such an experiment. And then with a sort of one-way quantum computing methods that people have thought of, or maybe variants, one can really realize quantum computation algorithms. All right, so let's say one is not going to yet use these neutral atom systems as quantum computers, but instead simply use them as quantum simulators. What kinds of interesting questions might we be able to address with them? And so I think the questions that I have here listed, I won't go through them, are the leading questions that are being posed today about materials in equilibrium and out of equilibrium. Again, realizing that materials just naturally are built the way my neutral atom array is built. That is, they're periodic, and they have near-range or short-range interactions between objects, and they develop, they can develop a high degree of entanglement. And moreover, they're typically large, so if we can study large systems, we can get to what we see in materials in the thermodynamic limit, I think, with a good approximation. Let me give you just a quick example of of a quantum simulation experiment, just so I can tell you about something that happened in our labs. And this is, let's call it the effort to simulate the Bose-Hubbard model. Okay, so the Bose-Hubbard model is the model of bosons that hop in a lattice while also interacting with one another. The Bose-Hubbard model can be studied either simply or with difficulty in numerics. And one sees there's a transition there's a phase diagram that describes the transition of a system described by the Bose-Hubbard Hamiltonian, which goes from a superfluid state to a mod-insulating state. The superfluid state has coherence, and you can measure that coherence. Okay, so it turns out that the simplest way to treat the Bose-Hubbard system is apply a Weiss-type mean field theory to the problem. And the outcome of that kind of very simple treatment, so simple that it's even hardly described in the paper that introduced it, is that all the properties of the Bose-Hubbard system, which are, let's say, the number of atoms per site, the number of superfluid atoms per site, or the entropy per site, are all functions of scaled energies. And the scaled energies take into account the number of nearest neighbors that are in the lattice that you're studying. So this is a bold prediction, this mean field prediction, that specifics of a lattice make no difference in the Bose-Hubbard Hamiltonian, the specific dimensionality or the structure. The only thing that counts is the number of nearest neighbors. Okay, so we can run numerical simulations of the Bose-Hubbard model and see whether that prediction is correct. We can also run a quantum simulation to see if such a thing is correct. We can imagine studying the Bose-Hubbard system in one of 2 lattice choices that have a different number of nearest neighbors and see whether this scaling hypothesis is correct. Now, if you wanted to address this question here at LBL, which deputy director of LBL would I turn to get funds? And I might maybe turn to the material sciences division here at LBL, because maybe the way I want to address this question is experimentally. I'll ask some of the materials synthesis folks here at the lab to make a couple of different materials that have different coordination. We'll maybe vary tunneling and interaction energies by putting pressure on such materials. And then we'll study their transport properties and see whether we can find a relation between measurements on one piece of something and another piece of something. Okay, that's one approach. Or I would go up to the computer research division and I would say, you know, I think what I really want to do is just run this numerically and just see whether the result of very advanced numerics matches this mean field scaling prediction, and that'll also give me some confidence as to the answer. An experiment that instead we perform in our labs is some hybrid of these two approaches. What we do is we make what, if you will, is a material. We make a synthetic atomic material that can take one of two different lattice configurations, and then we probe its properties. But this synthetic material is a faithful representation of a quantum model, just like I would have tried to set up in my numerics. So it's some hybrid between an experiment and a computation. That's exactly the approach we want to take towards solving general problems in many-body quantum physics. We, in fact, performed such an experiment, and I'll just briefly, we used a type of lattice configuration that allows us to bridge between one geometry and another. And I bring this up just to highlight that this paper carries also, this actually was supported through my appointment in the Material Sciences Division, so I guess you can see who won the fight in the previous slide. But just to say that this is you know, a capability that we have to some degree in-house here at the labs. We're ready to start performing such large-scale quantum simulations with neutral atoms. And the outcome of this particular investigation, and here's the folks that did the work, is that yes, indeed, if you measure system properties and you scale energies by the proper number of nearest neighbors, the data fairly collapse onto one another. Now, that Bose-Hubbard simulation is probably one that we could have done numerically without too much effort. I don't think any of my computer research folks would have sweated too much over trying to calculate the exact answer for that experiment. But here's work in another cold atom lab. The Bloch group in Munich was doing experiments on two-dimensional quantum gases that were moving in a disordered potential. And they used this experiment to test a theoretical hypothesis, which is the existence of the many-body localized state in dimensions larger than one. So there are no theoretical computations that they can compare their experiments to. There's strong predictions for MBL in one dimension, but higher than one dimension, there's really no way to run the numerical calculations. It's a dynamics problem that quickly gets out of hand. So here's the experiment, and the result is, well, I don't know what the result is, some level of localization indeed due to disorder in two dimensions. So this is an experiment, this is a quantum simulation that is achieving an answer which numerics can't. Right? So does this mean that neutral atoms, as Claire had intimated, have indeed surpassed this quantum supremacy threshold? I'll leave it to you to decide. We are interested in augmenting our toolkit by replacing the neutral atoms in these lattices with polar molecules. The idea is to take atoms of two different elements and use light to stitch them together into ground state molecules. And the folks working on that experiment are listed here, and I see Shun in the back, who is, was sponsored through the LDRD program for a while. And so replacing atoms with molecules has some real advantages. One can get to simulations that would involve much stronger interactions between particles at neighboring sites. One could use selective photoassociation to basically place molecules at chosen points within a two-dimensional or three-dimensional field, and thereby basically reprogram your computation as you wish. And one can also now reach this last step that one needed, I thought, for quantum computation, which is to make localized non-destructive measurements in such a microscope.